Thanks so much, everybody, for joining in. We are still a few minutes from getting started, but it's great to see you. Thanks so much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. We'll be starting in a few moments. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I know that there's people still trickling in, um, but we would like to start the event now. I would like to welcome you all to this webinar titled Exploring the Implications of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights Advisory Opinion on the Responsibility and the Illegal Trafficking of Firearms. This event is being co-hosted by Control Arms, the Forum on Arms Trade, Global Exchange, and Stop U.S. Arms to Mexico. I just want to go over a few admin points. The chat and the Q&A feature are enabled during the webinar. Please be respectful in the chat. We can see all of your questions in the Q&A, and so we will get to those questions at the very end. You can also raise your hand and be called on to verbally speak your question. So I also want to remind you and note that we have interpretation. And so if you wish to activate this, please go to the bottom of your screen, click the interpretation globe and select your language of choice. And we'll begin now. And I just want to introduce myself. I'm Tania del Moral, the moderator for today's discussion. I'm very pleased to be here with you today as Stop U.S. Arms and Global Exchange's Washington Advocacy Coordinator. And so as the Advocacy Coordinator, I channel our research on firearms trafficking with survivors' firsthand accounts to transform it into policy advocacy at the congressional level. And just to note that we are waiting on our special guest speaker, but I want to give a quick overview on this conversation and what we would cover. So to start off, in November 2022, the government of Mexico submitted a formal request to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights for an advisory opinion on the activities of private arms companies and their effects on human rights. Some of the questions that were pointed to indicated that, what does the marketing of firearms, does it constitute a violation of the rights to life and personal integrity? What are states obligated to do to prevent weapons from reaching the illegal market? And are laws granting procedural immunity to arms companies even compatible with states' obligations under the American Convention on Human Rights? So this process drew written observations from Bolivia, Colombia, Costa Rica, the United States, and Mexico, as well as from OAS bodies, including the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. It drew on the Arms Trade Treaty, the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, and the Inter-American Convention Against Illicit Manufacturing of Firearms, among others. So the opinion issued by the Inter-American Court on Human Rights in March 2026 affirms that states must ensure arms companies adopt human rights due diligence policies and to monitor risks of diversion and provide mechanisms for remedy, so that when supply chains cross borders, accountability must follow. It also addresses gender directly, since the Americas are the second most dangerous continent for women in terms of the risk of being killed by a partner or a family member. And the court is unequivocal that gender-based violence must be central to how we understand this crisis. So today I'm very pleased to say that we're joined by 3 experts from the Mexican government, from research on transnational crime and gender-based violence, and from the legal advocacy on behalf of survivors' perspective, to discuss what the court said, what it left open, and where this opinion opens doors for accountability and change. So I want to introduce our speakers, keeping in mind that we're still waiting on Ambassador Encinas to join us. But by order of appearance in our first round, I'd like to introduce you all to Pablo Adrián Arrocha Olabuenaga. Mr. Arrocha specializes in public international law with over 15 years of experience working for the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He has served in the office of the legal advisor and the undersecretary for multilateral affairs and human rights. His portfolio covers a broad range of issues, including UN law, law of the sea, human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international criminal law. The next speaker is Dr. Cecilia Farfán Méndez. Cecilia is the head of the North American Observatory at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. She is an expert on Mexican organized crime, U.S.-Mexico security cooperation, and gender mainstreaming. Her work focuses on understanding the business models of criminal groups. Last but not least, we have Beatrice Lindstrom. Beatrice is a lecturer on law and senior clinical instructor in the International Human Rights Clinic at Harvard Law School. Her research and advocacy focus on access to remedies for human rights violations in Haiti and other humanitarian crises, including advocating for accountability for arms trafficking to Haiti. So before joining Harvard, she served as the legal director of the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti, where she led groundbreaking litigation seeking remedies for victims of the devastating cholera epidemic introduced to Haiti by the UN. So it seems that we're still waiting on the ambassador, so I will go ahead and start on the questions, on the round one of questions, where we'll be talking about what happened with the advisory opinion, what the issues were raised. So I'd like to turn it over to Pablo first. And I want to ask you about your office, which has actively engaged in the initiative to request the advisory opinion. So, in your perspective, what are the firearms challenges faced in Mexico? And in a bit more detail, what is the role of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and why Mexico sought this advisory opinion? And after you, I see that the ambassador has joined. So after you, I will pass it over to the ambassador to give opening remarks.
Great. Thank you very much, Tania. And taking advantage of the fact that we have interpretation, I'll switch to Spanish for the rest of my comments. Me da mucho gusto estar aquí y poderlos acompañar en este panel sobre un tema que es prioritario para México, que nos parece fundamental abordar y que además creemos que avanza una causa positiva y que también ha sido señalada como una prioridad de la propia presidenta Claudia Sheinbaum y del canciller Roberto Velasco. Como ya mencionó Tania, México solicitó en noviembre de 2022 una opinión consultiva a la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos y México se enfocó principalmente en dos cuestiones para esta opinión consultiva. En primer lugar, cuál era la responsabilidad de actores privados que incurren en prácticas comerciales negligentes y, en segundo lugar, las medidas que deben tomar los estados para garantizar el acceso a la justicia de las víctimas de las prácticas negligentes de la industria privada. Y también, como Tania mencionó, el 5 de marzo la Corte finalmente notificó su opinión consultiva. Y en la opinión de México, el resultado y el contenido de la opinión consultiva es muy positivo. Es muy positivo y además valida en gran medida los argumentos que México ha esgrimido a lo largo de los años y en una estrategia legal mucho más amplia para poder hacer frente al fenómeno del tráfico ilícito de armas de fuego que entran a nuestro país. Y tratando de hacer un poco más de un análisis de profundidad sobre el contenido de la opinión consultiva de la Corte Interamericana, pues en primer lugar, lo importante y lo fundamental es que la propia Corte vincula al tráfico de armas de fuego con los derechos humanos. Habla y pone en perspectiva un panorama de seguridad y de conflicto también en la región, para poner en contexto las condiciones sobre las cuales está haciendo este análisis y presentando esta opinión consultiva. Y la Corte también es muy explícita en decir que el tráfico ilícito no es un problema que recae exclusivamente en los estados, sino que activa también el deber estatal de regular y supervisar y fiscalizar a personas morales cuyas actividades son clave para asegurar que no haya un tráfico ilícito. Y en ese sentido, la Corte también entonces profundiza en la cuestión de la debida diligencia y determina que la obligación principal, y cito de la opinión consultiva de la Corte, es actuar con debida diligencia en lo que respecta a la regulación, supervisión y fiscalización de la comercialización de las armas de fuego con el objetivo de evitar su tráfico ilícito o desarticularlo cuando esto ocurre. La opinión consultiva está estructurada en principalmente cuatro pilares de análisis de lo que trabaja la Corte. El primero se refiere al deber de adoptar disposiciones de derecho interno para prevenir el tráfico ilícito de armas y sus efectos negativos en los derechos humanos. Aquí es donde también la Corte, como mencionaba Tania en la introducción, se refiere a muchos otros instrumentos de derecho internacional, y cómo estos imponen ya obligaciones para aquellos que son estados parte de lo que tiene que regularse a nivel interno. En un segundo pilar, la Corte también habla de la obligación de fiscalizar y supervisar las actividades de las empresas comercializadoras de armas. Este me parece que es de los aspectos más importantes, por lo menos para México, y tomando en cuenta las razones por las cuales se solicitó esta opinión. Y la Corte empieza aclarando algo que es muy obvio, y es que las armas de fuego no son bienes ordinarios y las empresas que venden armas de fuego tampoco son actores económicos neutrales, sino que son sujetos que tienen una responsabilidad directa en el manejo y en el cuidado de sus productos. Y por lo tanto reconoce entonces el papel de las empresas para garantizar el respeto de los derechos humanos a través de medidas de prevención de las propias empresas para que sus actividades no tengan un impacto negativo en la población. Hace referencia a los principios rectores de la ONU sobre empresas y derechos humanos para hacer este vínculo sobre el alcance de las obligaciones de empresas y de particulares. En un tercer pilar habla de la responsabilidad de garantizar recursos judiciales que sean efectivos para aquellas víctimas de violaciones a derechos humanos que están ligadas precisamente con el tráfico de armas. Y esto también es muy importante porque lo que dice es que los estados no deben obstaculizar el acceso a la justicia de las familias y de las víctimas de violaciones a derechos humanos por tráfico ilícito de armas. Y esto entonces también tiene un impacto en el análisis que se haga de los regímenes de inmunidad procesal que protegen a la industria armamentista. Y finalmente, el cuarto pilar que aborda la Corte tiene que ver con la importancia de la cooperación internacional. Un elemento que también es fundamental y es obvio, tomando en cuenta que pues se trata de un fenómeno regional, inclusive global, donde no solamente un Estado puede resolverlo, sino que se necesita la cooperación para evitar el trasiego de armas en el plano internacional, eh, entendiendo que este es un problema que no reconoce fronteras. Y México ha avanzado en este eje también en cooperación con Estados Unidos, donde se ha planteado un esquema ya en materia de seguridad basado en los principios de reciprocidad, de respeto a la soberanía e integridad territorial y a la responsabilidad compartida y diferenciada, promoviendo siempre la confianza mutua. En conclusión y para cerrar en esta primera intervención, eh, por cierto, luego tengo problemas con mi cámara, veo que por lo menos para mí mi imagen ya se congeló. Espero que ahora se descongele, pero espero que me puedan seguir escuchando. En cualquier manera, solamente iba a concluir y concluyo con 4 puntos fundamentales. El primero es que para México, esta opinión consultiva, la opinión consultiva 30/25, confirma lo que México ha planteado desde 2021, que es la necesidad de atender el tráfico ilícito de armas desde una perspectiva integral y de derechos humanos. En segundo lugar, la postura legal de México, que se ha reflejado también en otros esfuerzos mucho más amplios, incluyendo demandas de armas en Estados Unidos, y enfatiza que se necesitan esfuerzos conjuntos y responsabilidades compartidas. En tercer punto, ofrece también una oportunidad histórica para redefinir el enfoque con el que se aborda el tráfico ilícito de armas. Y en ese sentido, esta opinión consultiva también alimentará el trabajo del Comité Jurídico Interamericano, que actualmente estudia el tema de la responsabilidad de las empresas productoras y comercializadoras de armas en el campo de los derechos humanos, que está a cargo de su relator Alejandro Alday. Y como cuarto y último punto, pues subrayaría que todo esto no se trata solamente de una exigencia jurídica, sino que la Corte hace claro que se trata de una condición indispensable para la protección y el disfrute de los derechos humanos. Y por todo esto nos parece que la opinión consultiva y su contenido no es menor, es un gran avance en el plano del derecho internacional y en particular en nuestro ambiente regional para hacer frente y combatir este fenómeno delictivo que tanto afecta a nuestros países. Y aquí dejaría mi primera intervención. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Pablo. I'd like to remind you all that we have interpretation at the bottom of the screen, which you can activate, and I'll be switching over to English. Again, thank you, Pablo, for your interventions. I'd like to pass it on to Dr. Cecilia Farfan Mendez, who is the head of the North American Observatory in the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. So I want to delve in a little bit about how, I know that you're familiar with the criminal activity that firearms help enable in Mexico and also the gendered impacts of those activities. These are clearly, and there are many interconnected issues. And most importantly, the advisory opinion examines the impact of firearms trafficking and the violence on the rights of women and girls. So in your view, what are the three most important takeaways regarding these issues?
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you for our hosts for organizing this important event. I think this is certainly a very timely discussion in light of what's happening in the region, but also just in the context of Mexico-US security discussions. So let me focus on, as you mentioned, three things. So the first thing that I would highlight that I think is very important is that this advisory opinion clearly acknowledges that there's a differential impact on women and girls through firearms trafficking. And they specifically mention how women and girls are disproportionately affected by firearms trafficking, but also the presence of illicit firearms. And they mention, for instance, how the Pan American region is one of the most dangerous for women and girls. And I think acknowledging this reality is very important because a lot of the conversations around firearms trafficking tend to also be centered around organized crime, which often leads to a conversation about men, for instance, participating in criminal groups. And so the fact that they acknowledge these differential impacts and these disproportional negative impacts on women and girls, I think it's very important. In line with that, I think it's also relevant that the opinion highlights that it's not only the fact that firearms are used to commit violence, femicide, or perpetrate other types of violence against women and girls, but the mere presence of firearms in a household, for instance, also create a sense of insecurity for women and girls. So it's, again, not only about using them, but also the fact that they are present in these spaces that can create these threats for women and girls. And I think that's an important distinction because it certainly highlights how the ecosystem of a wider availability of firearms can change the types of violence that different populations face. And one of the things that the opinion does is, of course, cite a lot of data. And I would like to add one data point that I think precisely illustrates what the opinion was getting at. And so this data point comes from the survey on the perception of the quality of democracy in Mexico. This is a national representative survey in Mexico. And we ask people if they believe if firearms in their household actually provide greater security vis-a-vis organized crime. And the majority of Mexicans actually agree that having firearms in their households does not provide more security against organized crime. More importantly, 60% of women said that they do not think that having a firearm in their household would provide greater security. So that shows you precisely, I think, and illustrates what the opinion highlights, that these firearms change the context in which women live. Third important element that the opinion does in terms of gender is that it also recognizes that women and gender diverse populations, but especially women, are not only victims of firearms violence. And in fact, they play a very important role in reducing violence, and they should be part and they should be agents of conflict reduction and pacification processes. And this is important, again, because it also recognizes that the different roles that women play in these spaces, either through formal institutions, but also in informal settings. And so this is something that certainly requires more research. And the last point that I'll highlight, and this connects, of course, to the second part of my intervention, is that the opinion also recognizes that there are differential impacts of violence against LGBTQI+ populations, but more research is needed to understand this. And this, in my opinion, is very important because this definitely opens the door for member states or just states in general to work with civil society in creative ways to precisely generate this important research. And this matters because in Latin America in particular, one statistic that we often cite is that 70% of homicides are committed with a firearm. But in addition to that, when we want to start to unpack that, then we realize we don't have a lot of information. And through multilateral efforts, and again, I'll get into this in more detail in the second round of questions, we have been able to generate important information. But the fact that, again, this opinion acknowledges these impacts on gender diverse populations and the need for more research, I think is a very important step in fostering collaborations between states and organizations. And I'll stop there for this first round, and I look forward to listening to my fellow speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. And I see that the Ambassador Encinas has joined, so I'd like to welcome him to the webinar. And also just to introduce him, Ambassador Encinas possesses an extensive career in public service and legislative work. He's currently the Mexican ambassador to the Organization of American States. His previous roles include being the Secretary of the Environment, President of the Mexico City Constituent Assembly, and Secretary of Metropolis Affairs for Mexico City. At the federal level, he served as Undersecretary for Human Rights, Population, and Migration, and presided over mechanisms aimed at ensuring access to the truth and advancing justice. So again, thank you so much, Ambassador Encinas, for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias. En primer lugar, una disculpa, estábamos en una sesión aquí en la Comisión para la Acreditación de las Organizaciones de la Sociedad Civil para la Asamblea General de Panamá y había la pretensión de bloquear la posibilidad de que organizaciones no registradas pudieran participar. Logramos posponer esta discusión, pero lamentablemente se pretende cerrar mucho la participación de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil en la Asamblea General de la OEA, pero vamos a hacer el esfuerzo para que esto continúe. Pero en primer lugar, después de ofrecer esta disculpa, yo sí quiero agradecer a Control Arms, a Global Exchange, a Stobos US Arms to Mexico y Forum on the Arms Trade por la organización de esta reunión y por la invitación a dirigirles algunas palabras en un momento, yo creo que importante para la discusión que estamos realizando, ya que recientemente la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos emitió una opinión consultiva que nosotros solicitamos sobre la responsabilidad de los estados en materia de derechos humanos frente al tráfico ilícito de armas de fuego, lo que a nuestro juicio constituye uno de los hechos más relevantes del derecho interamericano de manera reciente, porque establece con mucha claridad que la violencia armada y el tráfico ilícito de armas no son únicamente un problema de seguridad pública o de combate al crimen organizado, sino fenómenos que inciden directamente en el goce y ejercicio de los derechos humanos. Y por lo cual, todos los estados tenemos la obligación de adoptar medidas razonables y eficaces para prevenir que las armas de fuego sean desviadas hacia mercados ilícitos cuando esto pueda generar riesgos predecibles para la vida, la integridad personal, la libertad y la seguridad de las personas, tanto dentro como fuera de las fronteras de los distintos países. Consideramos además que la relevancia de esta opinión consultiva es evidente en un contexto, el actual contexto regional, que se caracteriza por la expansión de las organizaciones criminales cada vez más complejas y cada día más violentas. Hemos registrado cómo en las últimas décadas muchas pandillas y grupos delictivos evolucionaron desde estructuras locales vinculadas a dinámicas comunitarias y territoriales hacia redes criminales transnacionales con capacidad para participar en el tráfico de drogas, la trata de personas, la extorsión, el secuestro, el lavado de activos y otras actividades ilícitas, con lo cual la disponibilidad de armas de fuego se ha constituido en uno de los principales factores que potencian su capacidad depurativa y su capacidad de control territorial. Tradicionalmente, el análisis de la violencia asociada al crimen organizado se concentraba en los estados donde ocurrían los hechos violentos. Sin embargo, dentro de estos cambios, y esto lo reconoce la opinión consultiva, la Corte establece que los estados tienen obligaciones de debida diligencia respecto de actividades bajo su jurisdicción y que puedan contribuir al tráfico ilícito de armas hacia otros países. Esto implica fortalecer los sistemas de licenciamiento, supervisar a fabricantes y distribuidores, mejorar los mecanismos de marcaje y trazabilidad de las armas, el tráfico transfronterizo y cooperar de manera eficaz en investigaciones y procedimientos judiciales. Yo creo que la omisión en la adopción de estas medidas para prevenir el desvío de las armas podría generar ya con esta resolución responsabilidad internacional cuando existe una relación previsible entre la omisión y la afectación de los derechos humanos. Las implicaciones de este criterio son significativas para el continente americano, donde el flujo ilícito de armas, particularmente de Estados Unidos, alimenta múltiples expresiones de violencia criminal. La opinión consultiva introduce una visión de responsabilidad compartida que trasciende las explicaciones tradicionales centradas exclusivamente en los países productores o de tránsito de drogas. Y bajo esta lógica, la violencia asociada a los cárteles y organizaciones criminales debe analizarse a la luz de otros factores estructurales como la disponibilidad de armamento, los mercados ilícitos que lo distribuyen, los mecanismos financieros que facilitan las ganancias criminales y las deficiencias regulatorias que permiten su circulación y desarrollo. Por ello, consideramos que el debate tiene que darse desde una perspectiva racional e interdependiente de seguridad y derechos humanos, fortaleciendo la cooperación internacional como obligación jurídica y no únicamente como una política de carácter discrecional. Por ello, los estados estamos llamados a intercambiar información, a compartir inteligencia, a desarrollar investigaciones conjuntas para enfrentar las redes criminales que operan en nuestras distintas jurisdicciones. Esta interpretación de la Corte resulta en particular relevante ante los fenómenos delictivos que no reconocen fronteras y cuya capacidad de adaptación supera con frecuencia las respuestas fragmentadas y aisladas que lo que demandan para la protección de los derechos humanos son respuestas de carácter integral. El combate al tráfico ilícito de armas no puede limitarse a medidas represivas o militarizadas, sino que debe acompañarse de instituciones de justicia eficaces, mecanismos de rendición de cuentas, prevención de la violencia, atención a las víctimas y políticas orientadas a reducir los factores de vulnerabilidad que favorecen la expansión de las organizaciones criminales. En este sentido, la Corte, con esta opinión, consolida una concepción de la seguridad centrada en las personas y en la garantía efectiva de sus derechos fundamentales que como país en México compartimos plenamente. Los estados no solo deben responder por la violencia que ocurre dentro de sus territorios, sino también por las acciones o omisiones que contribuyan al flujo ilícito de armamento que alimenta graves violaciones a los derechos humanos en la región. Necesitamos consolidar un enfoque de corresponsabilidad, prevención y cooperación internacional que coloca la protección de la vida y la dignidad humana en el centro de las políticas de seguridad. Por ello, la respuesta tiene que ser el fortalecimiento del multilateralismo, revitalizar los espacios de diálogo político y reafirmar sin ambigüedades el respeto al derecho internacional que lamentablemente en estos momentos se encuentra extremadamente debilitado, al igual que el multilateralismo, y que se exige de manera particular una acción más enérgica también desde la sociedad civil para que los estados cumplan con su responsabilidad y que se entienda que ese fenómeno no puede atenderse de manera unilateral o solo por alguno de los países, sino tenemos que concurrir en una acción coordinada, eficaz, para combatir a estas bandas y organizaciones criminales que trascienden nuestras fronteras. Yo quisiera hacerles llegar esta reflexión sobre la opinión consultiva que se ha emitido. Creo que vale la pena analizarla y explorarla porque va a abrir un nuevo hito en el debate sobre el tráfico ilícito de armas y municiones en todo el continente. Muchísimas gracias por la invitación.
Gracias, Embajador. Thank you so much for your participation and your cooperation across borders and with civil society to ensure that this opinion is fulfilled by member states. Thank you. So speaking of cross-border coordination, I'd like to turn it over to an expert on the U.S. context, as many of the firearms trafficked in the Western Hemisphere come from this side of the border. Beatrice Lindstrom is the senior clinical instructor at the Harvard Law School. And, some of your research is very focused on U.S. federal firearm licensees, also known as FFLs, and other U.S. laws. So as you look at what's happening in the U.S., what are you finding to be most alarming? And does this advisory opinion offer an opportunity to address or frame those developments? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I want to speak about some of the trends that we see emerging here in the United States. But I also want to take as my entry point to this issue a focus on the impacts in Haiti, which is where I spent a lot of my career focusing. And Haiti at the moment is experiencing a massive human rights crisis where armed groups are carrying out massacres and other gross human rights violations against the population. In 2025 alone, over 8,000 people were killed and over 1.4 million people are now displaced as a result of the violence. These abuses are facilitated by easy access to firearms and ammunition smuggled into Haiti from abroad, especially sourced from the United States. Haiti doesn't have any domestic manufacturers, yet there are an estimated 500,000 guns in circulation, and the problem is only getting worse. And so addressing the crisis in Haiti requires policy action at many levels, but disrupting arms flows to Haiti is one concrete action that would radically alter the security situation on the ground. So against this background, the Human Rights Clinic at Harvard Law School, where I teach, has been investigating pathways to accountability for licensed dealers or FFLs that are selling guns to straw buyers and arms traffickers that are causing harm in Haiti. And through available trace data, we know that a significant number of arms that end up in Haiti are being sourced in Florida. But US law has many barriers to accountability, including laws that prevent public disclosure of which specific dealers the arms are being traced to. Yet by analyzing various sources, it's still possible to narrow in on both specific zip codes and even dealers within those zip codes that are the most likely culprits. And their geographic concentration and what we know based on indictments strongly suggests that there are dealers that are routinely ignoring red flags and at times knowingly selling to traffickers. In other words, they're engaging in unlawful conduct that is contributing to human rights violations abroad. We know that that is the case for Mexico, and we know that that is the case for Haiti. And yet when it comes to cracking down on actors that are contributing to human rights violations in Haiti, the US government is largely overlooking its own gun industry. And so I think one of the things that we see is a tension emerging where, on the one hand, the US is taking actions to crack down on individuals and actors involved with armed groups. So they've designated 2 of Haiti's largest gang coalitions as foreign terrorist organizations. Individual gang leaders and some enablers have been sanctioned. And there has been criminal prosecutions of smugglers of arms. And yet, on the other hand, the legal landscape is perhaps increasingly protective of the gun industry itself. And one of the biggest barriers to accountability in the US is the proliferation of immunities laws that protect the gun industry at both the federal and state levels and deprive victims from accessing remedies. And so at the federal level, there is the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, or the PLACA, which immunizes gun manufacturers and dealers from many suits that arise when a third party has used their guns to cause harm. And at the state level, there are also immunity laws that in some states mirror the PLACA, but sometimes go even further and are even more stringent in protecting the gun industry. And these laws are primarily trying to eliminate the possibility of states and local governments to take action on behalf of their own residents in order to fill gaps where the federal government is failing. But in some states, the laws also either explicitly bar or effectively chill victims from being able to sue. And and I think of great concern, more and more of these laws are being enacted across different states in the United States. It's worth noting that this trend is not absolute. There are also some states that are trying to make it easier for victims to sue. But nonetheless, I think the accountability gap for the gun industry is a serious problem. And this is where I think this advisory opinion is so important, because as others have spoken about, it directly addresses that gap. It establishes the responsibility of the gun industry and the state to ensure due diligence that will prevent human rights violations. It squarely establishes that dealers have a responsibility to prevent arms trafficking through their own operations and sales practices, as Pablo has stressed, and it stresses that the state must ensure that this happens through regulation, through monitoring, and so on. And so I think that what this advisory opinion does is it creates an opportunity to really recenter the obligations of both the US government and of individual gun dealers and manufacturers in preventing human rights violations from taking place in places like Haiti and Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice, for your interventions. And I'd like to remind you all that the Q&A box is open. Please engage if you have any questions there, and the chat is also open as well. And so now looking ahead into what the advisory opinion would have as an impact, I actually want to turn it back to you, Beatrice. Given that an overlooked aspect of firearms trafficking is the right of victims to access justice, as you already mentioned, can you tell us a little bit more about what the advisory opinion states on this issue and how access to legal remedies factored into your efforts? And, maybe if you could speak more broadly about the global implications of this advisory on some of the international bodies you work with and some of the frameworks as well. I'll pass it over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so access to justice and accountability for human rights violations has long been sort of a key motivator of our work. And when we think about accountability, it's really from two perspectives. So on the one hand, holding those actors who have a shared responsibility in the harm accountable for their role. And on the other hand, that it results in remedies that can contribute to the restoration of victims' dignity and repair the harms that were caused. And so international human rights law is clear that the right to effective remedy is fundamental. It's core to the rule of law, to democratic societies, and it's key to upholding all other rights because there is no right without remedy. And it essentially guarantees two key aspects. So on the one hand, it addresses the right to procedure, to access a fair and independent process, but it also entails a substantive aspect in the form of reparations. And reparations can look like many different things. It can look like compensation. It can look like apologies or acknowledgement of the harm that restores dignity. It can involve guarantees of non-repetition or changes to practices that are meant to prevent the harm from reoccurring. And the question of access to justice for victims of human rights violations, I think, is a very live question in Haiti right now. There are a lot of conversations around how it can be done in ways that ensures access to courts for gross violations, but also in a way that is actually restorative for the victims and transformative for society. But as is often the case in Haiti, human rights abuses don't start or end within Haiti's borders. They are enabled, facilitated, and sometimes directly caused by external actors, in this case, the gun industry. And so here, I think the advisory opinion offers an important affirmation of the right to effective remedy. As the court has importantly found, and as has been highlighted in this panel, human rights law creates obligations that extend beyond the actor that may have pulled the trigger or directly caused the harm. And specifically, what the advisory opinion says is that in cases of illicit arms trafficking, states have the duty to guarantee effective judicial remedies for human rights violations generated both nationally and transnationally, whether committed by the state itself or, importantly, by third parties. And so this is a crucial, explicit application to this context of illicit arms trafficking. And it unequivocally says that where corporations breach their due diligence requirements and their firearms cause human rights violations in other countries, both the corporation and the state, the originating state, have an obligation to ensure access to effective remedy. At the same time, I think this is where perhaps the court could have gone further. The court chose to reformulate Mexico's question specifically about the interaction between immunity laws and access to effective remedies. And so the court doesn't really actually grapple with the nuances either around extraterritoriality, which is discussed in much more detail in the concurrence, but it also doesn't address whether immunity laws that in effect are some of the biggest barriers to access justice are compatible with the human right to effective remedy. So I think the court could have gone further and assessed, or at least reaffirmed, a framework for how to think about when such laws deprive victims of access to justice in ways that would violate international obligations. And I think that it's especially appropriate for the Inter-American Court to do so, given the gravity of the rights violations at stake in both Haiti and Mexico, where crimes by the cartels, by the armed groups in Haiti, have been found to amount to crimes against humanity. And I want to note also that the advisory opinion comes in the context of a broader trend by courts and treaty bodies to incrementally require stronger protection of access to justice. So there are cases internationally from the European Court and from the Human Rights Committee that affirm that when human rights are violated, immunities are only compatible with human rights law if there are reasonable alternative means to access justice. And importantly, other bodies have found that, at least in the context of international organizations, states may be under an obligation to exercise jurisdiction when those alternative means don't exist. And so I think this would suggest that in the absence of alternative means to access justice, U.S. immunity laws protecting the gun industry may actually be incompatible with the international legal obligations of the U.S. So just to conclude, while this advisory opinion doesn't address all of these questions, I think it does serve as a crucial stepping stone and as an important tool from which advocates can continue to work towards a legal regime that does more both to prevent human rights abuses by gun industry actors and to ensure that victims have access to remedy when such harms occur.
Thank you, Bia, for laying out how, like you said, that some of the actors often left out are the survivors, and what it means to, have these alternative means to access to justice and how it protects the gun industry. So thank you for laying that out. Now I'd like to turn it over to you, Cecilia, and to give a bit of context. Under the Arms Trade Treaty, significant progress has been made in implementing Article 7(4), which aims to prevent arms transfers that could facilitate serious gender-based violence, including violence against women. And last year, Mexico led an important initiative to establish ATT gender focal points, with Mexico, Spain, and Togo currently serving in this role. So the question is, as you think about advice you might give these focal points, could you more broadly share what priorities should the international and regional communities focus on to prevent firearms from contributing to gender-based violence? Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. I would highlight a couple of things. First, I would say that I believe this is a two-way street. And by that, I mean that currently in a context where multilateral spaces are being called into question, in particular in regard to their efficacy, I think this really provides an opportunity for civil society to really understand the technical work that takes place in a lot of these multilateral spaces. And by that, I mean, for instance, engaging with products that are published in relation to these. Of course, the focal points are very important, but let me cite a couple of things. So UNIDIR recently published, just last December, a toolkit focusing on addressing weapons-related risks in women, peace, and security in national action plans. And I think becoming familiar with this work will also help us, people in civil society, understand, how the multilateral spaces are advancing this work. I would also point at, for instance, the regional guidelines for the prevention of gender-based violence committed with the use of firearms in the Americas. that were also recently published by the Organization of American States. So on the side of civil society, I would say it's important for us to better understand this technical work and understand these products that multilateral spaces generate, and especially that have been produced in the context of firearms trafficking. Now, the other point, and I think this is especially relevant because, to be sure, considering the levels of violence that we have in the Americas, we're certainly building the fire truck on the way to the fire. And I think this should really open up spaces, as I was mentioning in my first intervention, for thinking about creative collaborations between international organizations and civil society. And so I'll give you an example that we're currently working on at the Global Initiative, and we have partnered with the Organization of American States to help develop one of the modules related to the first hemispheric study on firearms and ammunition trafficking that is currently being developed by the Organization of American States, a methodology that was approved also by member states a couple of years ago during the last CIFTA meeting. And importantly, what this does is, in this exercise, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel, but rather what we're doing is taking existing work from civil society and different organizations that have worked in this space and either replicate their methods or take their data to build on what already exists, and then think creatively on how we can achieve this. And I think especially, as we think of gender, this matters a lot because I think the gender conversation turns to be sidelined, being seen as a luxury product or something that countries are going to do once they have taken care of other important issues. And I think one of the points that we have highlighted precisely in this gender mainstreaming in the conversation of firearms trafficking is that gender is not a separate conversation from the main subject, but that should be central to it. And I think, as international organizations seek to improve their data systems, also their conversations and engagement with different member states, that opens up, again, a very interesting window of opportunity for working with civil society because, we all provide different strengths to these conversations. So I would like to see more of those creative collaborations taking place. I know from the civil society side, there's a lot of us who are interested and willing to help. And what we need oftentimes is that space from states to either provide information or, again, think about ways in which research can be shared to, effectively reduce violence. Because ultimately, this is not just an intellectual conversation. This is very much a conversation that can have great impacts in reducing the violence levels that we see in the region. And with that, I'll stop this second intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia, for laying out that point. And I really appreciated your comment about, how we were building the fire truck on the way to the fire, and how, Ambassador Encinas also pointed this out. The work with civil society is more important than ever in constructing these mechanisms of accountability and processes. So thank you for that intervention. And so finally, I'd like to, and also just to mention that Jeff has been inserting in the chat some of the resources that the panelists have been mentioning. So feel free to take a look at those. And on that note, maybe Jeff, if you can insert this article again. Pablo wrote an article in Just Security just after the opinion was made public, in which he concludes that cooperation is more important than ever. So where do you see that happening with the US? And more broadly, what do you believe the other states in the Americas region should focus on to prevent firearms trafficking and violence? And finally, if possible, how this opinion might help facilitate that. Thank you.
Gracias también por la pregunta. En efecto, nos parece que, como había mencionado en mi intervención inicial, un factor clave para poder atender este fenómeno es la cooperación internacional y esto parte de la premisa de que ningún país solo puede acabar con el fenómeno del tráfico ilícito, sobre todo cuando es un fenómeno que impacta el crimen organizado transnacional. Y por ello, el énfasis en la necesidad de cooperar entre estados es clave. Esto no es algo nuevo para México y en nuestra cooperación bilateral con Estados Unidos, pero sí es algo que se ha profundizado y que se ha puesto con más relieve sobre la mesa en los últimos tiempos. Ya había mencionado también en mi intervención anterior, pero lo reitero, que inclusive cuando el año pasado el secretario de Estado Marco Rubio hizo su visita a México, se entrevistó con la presidenta Claudia Sheinbaum, con el entonces canciller de la Fuente también, y México y Estados Unidos emitieron un posicionamiento conjunto de cooperación en materia de seguridad, que es público. Y en ese comunicado conjunto se hizo referencia explícita a la necesidad de cooperar no solamente para reducir el tráfico ilícito de estupefacientes y de drogas, sino que también se incluyó la dimensión de la necesidad de cooperar para poner fin al tráfico ilícito de armas, que esta ha sido una prioridad del gobierno mexicano y que hemos puesto sobre la mesa a la par en esa discusión de cómo cooperar en materia de seguridad. Y también es fundamental recordar que en esa misma declaración conjunta se aclaró que esa cooperación se tiene que llevar a cabo con base en los principios de reciprocidad, respeto a la soberanía y la integridad territorial de los países, responsabilidad compartida y diferenciada y confianza mutua. A partir de esa visita también se han establecido mesas de diálogo de alto nivel en materia de seguridad y ahí hay un componente en el que se está reforzando la cooperación entre ambos países en este tema. Existe también una cooperación de hace mucho tiempo entre las fuerzas y dependencias de seguridad en México con el Buró de Tabaco y Armas de Fuego de los Estados Unidos y Explosivos, que es una entidad fundamental del lado estadounidense para tener información y para poder cooperar y avanzar en esta agenda. Entonces, sin duda, este es un tema que se ha vuelto prioritario en la agenda bilateral, en el que se está avanzando. Me parece que la opinión consultiva refuerza precisamente la noción y la obligación de cooperar que tenemos. Y eso no necesariamente tiene un impacto negativo ni cancela otros esfuerzos de México, como la demanda que sigue abierta y en curso en una corte en Arizona, en Tucson, Arizona, en contra de tiendas de armas que están en la frontera, justamente por la negligencia de sus prácticas y que ello contribuye al tráfico ilícito de armas, que también va muy de la mano precisamente con los argumentos que reforzó la Corte Interamericana en su opinión consultiva. Entonces, me parece que el caso de México y Estados Unidos, si avanza, puede convertirse también en un buen caso de éxito que se pueda replicar, pero sin duda esto refuerza una noción mucho más amplia y a nivel internacional y a nivel global de la necesidad de colaborar y de cooperar entre estados para atender todos los fenómenos delictivos, en particular todo lo que se vincula con el crimen organizado transnacional y en específico el componente de armas, que es al final del día lo que le permite tener capacidad de fuego a las organizaciones delictivas. Esos serían mis comentarios al respecto. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Pablo, por esa intervención. And just would like to leave open a few minutes for discussion amongst the panelists before we move into the questions. So if anyone has any responses to what either panelist has said, now is the time. Doesn't sound like there is. So I will be moving on to the questions and the Q&A. Oh, I see you, Bia, turn your camera on.
Oh, no, I think we can go to Q&A. Thank you. And then if things emerge from that, perhaps we can continue the conversation.
Awesome. Great. So John Lindsay Poland of Stop U.S. Arms to Mexico poses a question for all the panelists. The United States has a system for tracing illicitly trafficked firearms that does not require advising gun manufacturers of their trafficked guns, nor advising manufacturers or dealers about where their firearms were recovered. So producers and dealers may be unaware of this trafficking happening across borders. So what do you think governments, including Mexico and the US, should do that to hold industry actors aware of specifics of trafficking of their firearms?
I'm happy to start us off, although I'm curious my co-panelist perspectives here as well. Thank you for this question, John. And I think what you're pointing to is exactly this broader problem that the U.S. system just really doesn't seem to be designed to try to enhance prevention and accountability that is centered in the duties that arms manufacturers and dealers themselves have. And I think you pointed to a very important aspect of the solution, which is also that if dealers and manufacturers don't know that this is what is happening, that is a lost opportunity to take more precautions to prevent it. And so in terms of what government specifically should do, you know, I think part of the challenge is that so much of this information also sits within the government that other actors can't really fill it in, right? And so in the United States, I think that the federal government really has this responsibility to put dealers and manufacturers on notice when firearms are recovered in other countries that have clearly been trafficked there.
Thank you, Bia. Anyone else want to respond to that question? Go ahead, Pablo.
Gracias. Si puedo agregar un par de comentarios. En primer lugar, me parece que, y solamente voy a adelantar 2 puntos sobre este tema. El primero es que las demandas que presentó México contra la industria de armas, una en Boston, Massachusetts, contra fabricantes y la otra que había mencionado en Arizona contra tiendas, creo que han servido para dar mucha luz precisamente a este tema de qué empresas se ven involucradas en el tráfico de armas, qué tipo de armas y de qué marcas son las que terminan en México saliendo de tiendas o de empresas en Estados Unidos. Y me parece también que si bien no hay un mecanismo, como lo menciona John, de manera específica, yo creo que lo que estas demandas nos mostraron a nosotros es que en muchas ocasiones las empresas saben y tienen conocimiento de este fenómeno y tienen conocimiento de dónde terminan las armas. Lo hemos presentado también inclusive en los procesos legales donde en el caso de manufactureras, empresas manufactureras, hay muchos de los productos que están diseñados precisamente para resultar atractivos al mercado del crimen organizado en México. Entonces, creo que en realidad hay mucho más de lo que se sabe en la industria de armas, de dónde terminan las armas, de lo que podría parecer solamente por los mecanismos legales y públicos. Eso por un lado. Y mi segundo comentario es que también me parece que aquí es donde es importante la obligación otra vez de los estados de tener que tener debida diligencia, en particular en estos elementos de regular, supervisar y fiscalizar lo que sucede con las armas. Y creo que mi preocupación no sería tanto el que la empresa tenga que saber que su arma es la que fue traficada, sino que el Estado asuma su responsabilidad de tener que regular, supervisar y fiscalizar para que sin importar cuál sea la tienda, cuáles sean las armas, al final del día, el fenómeno del tráfico ilícito pueda frenarse y que no sea una cuestión que solamente recaiga en cuáles son las armas que están llegando, sino un tema de fiscalización transversal que en realidad atiende el problema.
So I would like to just add a couple of thoughts to what Beatriz and Pablo had mentioned. And I think in the spirit of, you know, the creative research that I was mentioning, one of the things that has happened since the US designated certain criminal organizations as foreign terrorist organizations is that it has made the private sector very nervous, right? About how do they safeguard their supply chains, because they cannot say they didn't know, right? They cannot get out of, potentially a charge of providing material support to a terrorist organization by saying, I didn't know. There's this due diligence process. And now there's the first indictment that has come out in the US charging 2 US citizens for providing material support via firearms trafficking, a case that is happening in Arizona. But let me just float an idea. Wouldn't it be interesting, for instance, now that there's a potential also for stores and manufacturers to also be charged, for providing material support to terrorist organizations, for them to actively want to show that they're not providing that material support. So in the same way that now we have certifications for jewelry companies to show that they're not selling blood diamonds, similarly, something from the firearms industry. And this is not about more regulation, but this is about showing that you as a dealer and potentially a manufacturer are a responsible one, and then you're not engaging with that. And so, perhaps the silver lining of TO designation, I will let, the lawyers in the room discuss what this would imply. But I think, the FTO designation, as I said, has created an interesting window of opportunity to change the behavior of private actors that before did not see their actions as related to criminal activities. And so, perhaps some potential there.
Thank you. And I guess a follow-up to that point, how do you see the rollback of the ATF regulations in the United States playing a role in this, in terms of their said cooperation with Mexico, and in terms of their stated priorities in terms of their drug control strategy? Do you have any thoughts on that? Either Cecilia, Bea?
I mean, I guess I don't want to repeat myself here, but I do think it's sort of a part of this broader trend of what Cecilia also highlighted around, like, we have these FTO designations, we're coming down hard on trying to block material assistance especially in other contexts, but maybe potentially also in ways that will have flow-on effects for arms trafficking. And yet that is not keeping pace with the regulatory framework, or the regulatory framework of the gun industry in particular is not keeping pace with that. And so you end up having one actor that gets to kind of fall outside of these other legal frameworks that are potentially intended to try to create or prevent human rights abuses, at least by actors that have some ties to the United States, and then this blind spot for the gun industry itself.
Thank you, Bea. And now moving on to the second question in the Q&A. One participant wants to know your opinion regarding the relationship of the advisory opinion in relation to the Human Rights Council Resolution 56-9, entitled Human Rights and the Civilian Acquisition, Possession, and Use of Firearms, adopted in July 2024. Do any of you have any thoughts on that? Go ahead, Pablo.
Gracias. Un comentario solamente. Me parece que se refuerzan estos textos. Evidentemente las resoluciones del Consejo de Derechos Humanos tampoco son jurídicamente vinculantes, pero sí dan una buena guía para avanzar la agenda. Y en particular me parece muy relevante que el párrafo operativo 6 de esta resolución también hace referencia a obligaciones de empresas manufactureras, de empresas en general, de la industria armamentista, y hace referencia inclusive a los principios rectores de la ONU sobre empresas y derechos humanos de manera explícita en la resolución, que es un documento que también fue citado por la Corte Interamericana en su opinión consultiva para hablar de las responsabilidades de empresas, y por lo tanto me parece entonces que hay vasos comunicantes del mensaje que emite la Corte Interamericana, junto con lo que ya había establecido el Consejo de Derechos Humanos. Entonces, se refuerzan los mensajes y sin duda todo abona, ¿no?
Gracias, Pablo. And there's a follow-up question to what you had mentioned earlier about the joint statement signed by Rubio and President Sheinbaum that mentions ending firearms trafficking. So Meizu Lui asks that now that the U.S. is pushing to violate that promise with its threat of unilateral military action rather than pursuing a truly cooperative effort, can that statement be used to push back harder? And feel free to answer in whatever capacity you can as legal advisor. Thanks.
Sin duda, y me parece que la propia presidenta ha sido muy clara al respecto, que en México, para empezar, no hay que caer en estas provocaciones, hay que tener la cabeza fría y también lo importante es mantener la cooperación y la coordinación sin subordinación. Y en realidad ha habido muchas llamadas y conversaciones, no solamente a nivel de secretarios de Estado, pero también a nivel de jefes de Estado. La presidenta Sheinbaum y el presidente Trump tuvieron una nueva llamada hace poco y esta cooperación y esa colaboración continúa. Entonces, nos parece que ese sigue siendo para México el camino y la vía para continuar con el diálogo. Y sin duda, la importancia de estas declaraciones conjuntas es que hay un reconocimiento del respeto que se le tiene que dar a estos principios, que en realidad son principios de derecho internacional, que recogen principios que están en la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, que México ha incorporado a su constitución en los principios de política exterior en el artículo 89, fracción 10, y que tienen que ver con la integridad territorial, el respeto a la soberanía. Entonces, para México esa seguirá siendo la premisa.
Thank you. There's a question or intervention from someone who's in the audience who's supporting this webinar. Hinwei Luce is the director of Control Arms and is based in Geneva. Hinwei, perhaps you can talk about how this decision is relevant for those working on the arms trade treaty. Could you speak a little bit about that and share any insights you have?
Yeah, thanks very much, Tanya. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Well, first of all, I just want to, thank Tanya and Jeff for bringing this together with Control Arms, and also to thank the panelists Beatrice, Cecilia, and Pablo today. And really a big thanks to the government of Mexico for requesting this advisory opinion. It demonstrates that even though we face very difficult times in multilateralism in the United Nations and on firearms generally, that important progress in building the foundations for more effective action can actually happen. Next week, the Arms Trade Treaty will have its informal preparatory meeting where a number of issues are being discussed. Those include the connection between arms transfers and preventing gender-based violence, and also the role of the arms industry. I really recommend that people go in and read this advisory opinion. It has a lot to offer, and it picks up on just a number of different aspects of not only states' responsibilities, but the arms industry and how firearms can impact the human rights of communities and of individuals. And, for one example that I would draw on concerning the arms industry is not only do states have an obligation to ensure the rigorous regulation of the arms industry, but the arms industry itself on its own initiative must undertake due diligence. And, and the advisory opinion gives just a number of different examples. For example, that the arms industry is increasingly turning to social media, and it must consider the risks of such a move, how this impacts young people, children, how this impacts those who might take up arms. So these are much of what is addressed in the advisory opinion offers really good guidance and the future direction of work that can be undertaken at the Arms Trade Treaty. It's really, I think Cecilia said this, it's really for all of us to build on this advisory opinion. And at this time, it requires using all of our resources, all of our collective knowledge and expertise. It requires collaboration between not only states and civil society, but states, international organizations, regional organizations, and civil society and academics as well. So thanks once again. Oh, just one other point that I would make about this advisory opinion, and that is it draws on a number of different sources from work that the OAS has done to reporting of the Human Rights Council. And I know that there's been a question about the resolution that's put to the Human Rights Council on the impact of civilian possession of firearms on human rights. And it also draws on research such as that of the Small Arms Survey. So that's just yet another reason why I really recommend that people should go in and take a closer look at this advisory opinion. So thanks very much once again to not only our experts who have so generously joined us, but to everybody tuning in today.
Thank you, Hinwei, for that insight on the Arms Trade Treaty, and we'll keep an eye out on those preparatory sessions next week. Just before we close out, I'd like to ask you all, the panelists, if you have any closing thoughts, to please take the moment now to share them, and before we close out.
Thank you. I would like to add one point that I think is very relevant to the discussion of firearms trafficking and just violence in the region in general. And I think for some years, we have seen the increase of private security in the region as a response to the armed violence that we see in our countries. And I would like to offer this message to the private sector, that is, you're not going to buy yourself out of this problem. This is not, something that is going to be solved by having more private security. In fact, I would argue this could worsen the situation and the context in which, our communities live and carry out their daily lives. And so I think, as it was pointed out, that this is a whole of society effort, and that's not just saying it because it sounds nice, but truly because it really will take efforts from different parts and not just thinking that this is something that could be solved with private security. So thank you again for this space and the opportunity to discuss the advisory opinion in greater detail.
I just want to pick up on a couple of points that I think have come throughout this panel, which is the fact that the United States has such outsized negative human rights impacts on the situation in other countries. And I think there's no question that under the current administration that we've seen a retrenchment, both as it relates to international law and international cooperation, but also as it relates to regulation of the gun industry. And so these are major challenges in which I think this decision, once again, it offers us a really crucial tool that we collectively can use in our advocacy. And it's advocacy not just vis-a-vis governments, but also vis-a-vis the industry itself. And because the decision so helpfully clarifies those obligations in relation to both states and the industry itself, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to try to seek out opportunities to further the impact of this important advisory opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Bia, for that intervention. And just to close out, I would like to thank the panelists, Cecilia, Bia, Ambassador Encinas, and Pablo, who I see is back. Thank you so much for participating in this panel, for sharing your thoughts and how we should build on each other to enforce and to see this opinion through. And as Jeff put in the chat, after this webinar, please take a minute to provide feedback. It's a short survey, and we'll also be emailing you some follow-up resources and recommendations from the panelists. Sorry, Pablo, did you have any closing thoughts to this webinar?
No, muchas gracias y perdón por todos los problemas técnicos que he tenido. Solamente agradecer de nueva cuenta la invitación, que la conversación continúe. Es un tema muy importante, no solamente para México, sino para toda la región. Y aprovechemos la opinión consultiva de la Corte, capitalicémosla para bien, utilicémosla para poner más presión internacional en las obligaciones que tenemos que cubrir y tengamos siempre en mente que al final del día todo esto es no solamente por el bien de los estados, sino por la protección de nuestros ciudadanos y de la gente y de las víctimas, que son al final del día quienes más sufren de la violencia por el uso de armas de fuego y que es a quienes siempre tenemos que tener en mente en todos nuestros esfuerzos para avanzar en esta agenda del tráfico ilícito de armas. Pero gracias nuevamente y una enorme disculpa otra vez por los problemas técnicos que he tenido. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Pablo. And yeah, please fill out the survey as you leave the webinar. We thank you all for your participation and listening to the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.